I'm good, except I can't find the video I want to show. It's not the end of the world. I'm good. How are you? Alrighty. Okie dokie. Alrighty. So, miracle of miracles. Ta-da! Connected with Launchpad now. Now, if you've already bought your code and it's not the same email you use on Launchpad, don't sweat it. But if you've yet to get registered for Launchpad and your ebook, you can now just click this link directly from Launchpad assignments on Blackboard. I also moved the due date of the first assignment from Tuesday to today, recognizing that y'all didn't even get the links to the assignments till Monday. Also, just a gentle reminder for this course, all your deadlines are soft deadlines. So if you need to take a couple extra days, you don't even need to tell me, turn it in. And Launchpad won't even like mark you late or anything like that. So you have that option. What it turned out it was that somehow when you connected via Blackboard, my profile didn't exist. So as soon as I like went into user, like my user profile for the Launchpad system. So as soon as I set that up, magically your class appeared. So, you know, you win some, you lose some. You finally figure that out. That seems like something they should have figured out a bit before, but you know, what do I know? I just work here. That's above my pay grade. So you should now be able to access the ebook. You can buy access right here. If you buy access to Launchpad, it includes the ebook. Once you're in Launchpad, and I think this should take me to my login. Yeah. So once you buy Launchpad, a couple have been like, how do I find the assignments? If you go through the chapters, it is kind of complicated. The easiest way to do it is if you go to this left-hand panel and you just click calendar. If you do that, it'll show you the activities. Like these are the ones that are due today. You just click on it and then you would say open and it will open it for you and you can do it. So that is the quickest, fastest, easiest to find what's due. They will also now be here. So you can just click from here to get to them. So like if I were to click our first clinical choices, that's not due till after the first exam. It should, in theory, if all is working right, take me right there. Yep, exactly. So then I don't have to worry about it. Now, if you did use your email that is associated, like your VWU email that's associated with Blackboard and you bought it separately, you should still be able to link it. But again, if you can't link it, don't sweat it. It just means I have to hand transfer a couple grades instead of the whole class. It's totally worth it, no worries. So if you're having issues, clearly I can't be tech support because we all saw how long this took me. But in general, their tech support is really good. And again, they have a chat and a call that's open till like 2 a.m. So you can do it kind of any time of day. I don't think they do that for the professors, actually. I think they assume we're asleep then. So yeah, your first couple assignments for that are you watch a little video and then you answer some questions about it. And it should auto grade everything. So you should know how you do right afterwards. It's just much more interesting than y'all having to like do standard assignments, basically. Alrighty, so we were talking about Freud, and I have this really funny psychoanalysis clip I wanted to show you all, but like, I don't know if they took it off YouTube or what, but I cannot find it for the life of me. So I'll try to find it for in the future. But basically it is this, again, with the poor acting, this guy like pretending to be a client and saying like, I had this dream and it was about going to the movies with this woman I was on a date with who left the date. And then there's like someone sitting behind him wearing glasses and he's like, oh, I know what you're thinking to the therapist, that represents you because you sit behind me. And he's like, but you don't wear glasses. And the therapist has glasses on. So showing transference and all of that good stuff. All right, I'm going to take a minute to take attendance and then we will dive into talking more about the psychodynamic model. So Caitlin and Heidi, Oliver and Nora and Caitlin and Micaiah and Matthew and Daviana, Cameron, Grace, Michaela, Emily, Sarah, and Olivia. Hi, Daryl, David, Samantha, and Jenna. Okay, I'm getting close, y'all. I'm getting close. Probably week after next. I won't have to read that out loud. Thank you for your patience with my I can't even say my old brain, because my brain's always been like this. Or I just have trouble with names, so thank you for your patience with my dysfunctional brain. Alrighty, so how would Freud explain our case study? And I might have gone over this, but we'll take another minute to do it again. So if you remember, this is the 4-year-old who new siblings in the house and they're adopted. And so they're having some behavioral issues and moodiness and things like that. And they're like fighting people. This is something that happens with kiddos. I've known professors that like their kid seems perfectly fine. They go to school and start biting other kids. It's like, what? So they're snapping at others and biting adults. So Freud would immediately go oral fixation, oral stage, right? Chewing on things and then thinking about their history of being abandoned at a very young age. Freud would point to that and say, that's why you're fixated at the oral stage. And then focus on psychoanalysis, focusing on the relationship or lack thereof with the birth mother and perhaps also the adopted mother. Obviously, there are some issues with this model. As I've already mentioned, the idea that like sexual instincts are the basis for all behavior. Not only do we have issues with that in modern times, but like people who were Freud's contemporaries, this is where they would get into arguments with him. And like he and Jung stopped talking, things like that. And it was based on a very limited sample of women in Vienna. And these tended to be upper class women who could afford to pay for, I mean, like true traditional psychoanalysis is like 5 days a week. That's a lot of money out of pocket, right? So one of the interesting things is that Freud's early theories were that a lot of these women presented with hysterical symptoms or symptoms of what we would now probably call PTSD had been abused, often by their fathers, uncles, things like that. He changed that idea throughout his career and just said, oh no, there's something just wrong with their unconscious. And there's some evidence to suggest the reason he changed his opinion is because the abusers were the ones paying his bills. That's problematic, obviously. There's also limited evidence of success of particularly traditional long-term psychoanalysis with many disorders. And again, it's lengthy and expensive, 3 to 5 times a week, and it goes on for years. And then it's not based on empirical research, and many of the components simply can't be empirically tested. Like you can't test the id, right? If it's unconscious, how do we get to it, right? And what's really interesting is psychoanalysts often actually say, we shouldn't bother doing research. That like, that's a problem if you want to do research, which is very much in contrast with a lot of the other models we're going to talk about. So just from a like clinical science perspective, this is, a lot of people don't necessarily buy into this anymore. I think that's a nice PC way to say it. That being said, there are still plenty of practicing psychoanalysts. And in fact, when I teach my clinical psych course, which I do every other spring, I bring in a psychoanalyst to talk to my students so they can kind of pick his brain. Alrighty, then we have the behavioral model. And this model is based on behaviors and the responses an organism, whether that's an animal or a person, makes to its environment. This is based on the principles and theories of learning. And there are 3 main principles we'll be talking about here. The first is classical conditioning, which was developed by Pavlov, and each of these will have their own slides, so we'll go through them in more detail. The second is operant conditioning, which lots of people worked on this, but Skinner's kind of the big name. And then modeling, which is also sometimes called observational learning, and the big name here is Bandura. Alrighty, so operant conditioning is, really, there we go. For some reason, when I click, this wants to go ahead 2 slides, so I'll use the arrows. Classical conditioning. is really interesting because the person that discovered it, Pavlov, was not a psychologist. He was actually studying digestion. And one of the things he was interested in is how our saliva starts the process of digestion before we even swallow the food. So he was studying that process in dogs. And what he found is that these dogs are smart, right? They start to figure things out. Those of you who've had dogs, or some cats will do this too, right? And you go, it's like around the time they get fed, and you go into the room where their food is, and they're right there. My cat is this way. Like, it's around 3 o'clock, and I'm headed to the kitchen. He's like right by my feet. He's waiting. He's like, it's time for my wet food. Let's go. Right. And so dogs would actually start to recognize the footsteps of the research assistants who fed them. And when they heard those footsteps, they would start drooling. So before the food was even in front of them, before they even had the food in their mouth. And Pavlov was kind of like, what's going on here? And he's had some fun kind of playing with this idea. So what he came up with is that there exist in nature unconditioned stimuluses, which are abbreviated as UCS or US. And these are things that naturally elicit an unconditioned response, UCR or UR. So in the case of the dogs, food is going to make them drool. It just happens as soon as a dog, or really pretty much any species that uses saliva to help break down its food, as soon as that food touches your mouth, you start drooling. And for us, it's mostly interior, right? And for some dogs more than others, those of you who have hung around, especially with like dogs like St. Bernards, right? You get lots of drool. And that happens. We don't need to train that. That just happens naturally, right? Dog gets food, they start drooling. Then he said, what we can do is take something neutral and pair it with that unconditioned stimulus. So in the case of his initial observation, it was the footsteps of the people who fed the dogs, but he started thinking like, well, what if we rang a bell every time we fed them? Would they figure that out? So if you pair this neutral stimulus of the bell with the unconditioned stimulus of the food enough times, then the dog will eventually start to drool just to the bell, just like they did with the footsteps. And so the bell has gone from this neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, or CS. And that causes the conditioned response of drooling, which is identical to the unconditioned response. I think that's the one thing that gets tricky, where people like kind of lose track sometimes in classical conditioning, is the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are the same thing. We're just essentially training a person or an animal to pair that stimulus with a new, or pair that response with a new stimulus. There we go. And again, I'm supposed to have a video here. This one I think I can find real quick, so give me a second. That's what I get for not checking my links before I came to class. All righty. Here we go. So again, not necessarily well acted, but a nice little explanation.
Yeah, sure.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5.
Like the caption version.
Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool.
Just love, I know you're back there.
Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
So I always like that clip. I'm going to go ahead and make sure this is linked for next time I teach this class, because I think it's a really nice example of, you know what, we'll just do this. Of looking at something like a classic experiment and what it might have actually looked like. There we go. Next time I teach this, it'll be right there. All right. Okay. So we know how this works in dogs, right? How does that apply to people? How does that apply to psychopathology? Well, the idea here, let me turn on the sun because this room is warm and it's right after lunch and we'll all fall asleep. Is, you know, this can happen with things like anxiety. So let's say you have a natural fear response to a threat. That makes sense. Let's say you're walking down a dark street and you're threatened your mother. Someone says, give me your wallet. Maybe they're holding you at gunpoint. And of course you give them their wallet because you're afraid of losing your life, right? But the next time you walk down that same street, which maybe you've walked down hundreds or thousands of times before, now that will bring up the memories of that threat and you will experience those symptoms of fear. This can be how phobias develop. This also can be part of PTSD. And so this can certainly explain how and why people seem to have sort of like what outside, if you don't know the little story, seems irrational. Like, why don't you want to go down this street? It's like one of the biggest streets. Everyone goes down that street. Well, you know, I have this fear response. All right, so the next one we're going to talk about is operant conditioning. And here we are going to be purposely influencing how likely something is to do a particular response. And this could be, again, an animal or a person. And you do this by virtue of its consequences. So you're going to either get a response to happen more often if you are reinforcing or rewarding it. And you get a response to happen less often if you are punishing it. And I have a little diagram I'll draw as we go through this as well. All right, so we've got. Hang on. Give me a sec. Yes. All right, so we've got reinforcement. And then we've got punishment. Okay. And then each of those can be either positive or negative, and I'll explain what that means as I go through, because I know positive punishment sounds like an oxymoron. Reinforcement is used to get a behavior to occur more frequently by rewarding the behavior. So you're saying if I give you a reward when you do something I want you to do, you're more likely to do it again in the future. Positive reinforcement is where you are going to give something desirable to make a behavior occur more often. So first I'll start with reinforcement. In both of you're trying to get the behavior to occur more often. Okay. In positive reinforcement, you're going to add something they like. Okay. So this easiest way to think of positive reinforcement is dog training. They do something well, you give them a cookie. Boom. But you can do this with kiddos too. If a kid is nice to their sibling, you might give them candy, or it can be more simple, like a high five, right? Every time they are doing the thing you want them to do. But you can also have negative reinforcement. And in negative reinforcement, I probably need to make my box a little bigger. I'll do this. You're going to take away something they don't like. So this time, kid is good to their sibling, and you say, you don't have to do your chores today. Okay, so, and to apply this to psychopathology, let's take that example of the person who is mugged and they develop a fear of going down a specific street. Fear is a really negative emotion. It's something we do not like to experience, right? So that person will probably start avoiding that street. They'll start taking a different way to get home. And that avoidance in and of itself is negative reinforcement. Because by avoiding the feared stimulus, they don't have to experience that awful negative fear feeling. And so this is how a lot of phobias and anxiety-related conditions become sort of self-perpetuating. Maybe because you avoid them, because that's going to make you if you go to see it, you're going to experience fear, so you avoid it. And then when you avoid it, you don't have to have those yucky feelings. So then that's reinforcing it. So then you're just going to avoid it even more, right? So it kind of becomes a cycle. So one of the things we can talk about here is that positive, we're always going to be giving something, and negative, we're always going to be taking something away. And in fact, maybe to make it more clear, I'll give here. So it's not like an emotion or valence here. Positive just means like add, and negative just means like subtract. And so positive punishment, or punishment in general, you're trying to get the behavior to occur less often by punishing the behavior. So in both cases, you're trying to decrease the behavior. Again, positive punishment sounds like an oxymoron, but this is when you give something undesirable. So you're going to give something they don't like. Unfortunately, in the past, and sometimes still now, this is things like corporal punishment, right? Kid does something you don't like, you spank them. That's an example of positive punishment. It sounds really weird because they're not saying that's a good thing. They're saying we're adding something they don't like in order to punish that behavior and try to make it occur less often. Now, there's all kinds of psychological research suggesting that's actually not that effective. And in fact, it causes more problems down the road, but what have you. Negative punishment is where you take something away they want or they like. All right, let me try to attempt to make this legible. There we go. In order to punish them. You hit your sibling, you don't get to watch on a Bluey tonight, whatever the Bluey show is. My kid likes Octonauts, but that's kind of niche. Now, a lot of people know what that is. So the idea is you're taking away something they want in order to punish them. So both of these, reinforcement and punishment, are used to try to change behavior. And you can imagine how these things can sort of unintentionally happen, right, throughout our lives, again, with things like anxiety. All right, now modeling involves learning in the absence of any direct reinforcements. You learn by watching other people. And so the model is going to impart information to the observer. The observer watches what happens to the model. Is the model punished? Is the model rewarded? Right? And so the classic study on this was by Bandura, and it looked at whether children can learn about aggression by watching models, other people, be aggressive. Here, I think I can actually access this from my Google Drive. We'll give it a whirl, and if not, back to good old YouTube. All right. Oops, hang on. No, I don't have the chapter. Why would I have the chapter I need? That makes sense. All right, that's fine. This one is widely available on YouTube. Alrighty, we'll watch the longer one. Okay, so this is an official video that was produced about this experiment, and you're gonna see Bandura talk about it, and then you will see some kiddos who actually took part in the experiment.
The segment you're about to see is taken from an early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. For example, to test how well bombardiers have learned bombing strategies, you would use simulated targets rather than require them to bomb San Francisco or New York. The model pummeled the doll with a mallet, flung it in the air.
So I should just say,
Kicked it repeatedly.
in different versions of the experiment, the kids either watch the adult do this live, or sometimes they watched a video of the adult doing it, and the results weren't really that different.
Repeatedly. Threw it down and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language.
I like this clip because you can see it's not just the little boys that copied the behavior. I think we have a lot of sexist ideas still, and I think, oh, little boys are just so aggressive. This little girl copied all the behaviors, and you'll see some of the creative ways that she became aggressive as well.
The room contained varied play materials, and children could choose to play aggressively or non-aggressively. The children devised new ways of hitting the doll. Now, the object of interest was the novel aggressive acts, not punching the doll. And children in the control group who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling never exhibited the novel forms of aggression. And here's a creative embellishment. A doll becomes a weapon of assault.
So what this shows is that, kids, people, animals, right, might learn our maladaptive behavior from watching other people, from watching other beings, right? And certainly there's a lot of evidence for this. For example, in the case of domestic violence, we know that a lot of folks who are abusers were abused themselves as kids. But even things like ways to address conflict, right? Ways to deal with anxiety or emotions in general. Those are often learned by watching the people around us. And those can contribute to psychopathology, right? And so this becomes very important. And I think I've mentioned this previously, but you also obviously can use this for good. So for example, one of the things we'll talk about in just a minute is how we incorporate modeling into therapy. If the therapist can do it, the client has more confidence. Bandura himself used a lot of this modeling to try to change attitudes about people. So on radio shows in sub-Saharan Africa, on telenovelas in New Mexico and Central America, he would introduce, for example, HIV positive characters, work with a production company. And they found that nationwide attitudes would change after those characters were introduced. More acceptance, less stigmatization. And so treatments based on the behavioral theory focus on the problematic behaviors. We're not looking at dynamic underlying problems or your relationship with your mom or anything like that. Instead, what we're looking at is how can we just get those behaviors to change to something more adaptive for you? One of the ways we do that is exposure. So exposure in particular is used to address anxiety and phobias. So you would expose that person to the feared element, often through a series of steps, and that's called systematic desensitization. So you would sit down before you started this with the client, and you would have them rank from like 0 to 100. What's the least scary thing about this phobia? What's the most scary? So we often use a snake phobia as an example, because it's something that treatment shows works pretty well, and also is easier to conceptualize. So, you know, a 0 or a low rating for someone might be, you know, like, I'm here at the doorway and the snake is way over there in the corner in a locked container, right? And their most scary thing would be holding the snake. And so what you do is then you work with the client and you teach them relaxation techniques, you teach them breathing techniques so that as they get anxious, as you work through their hierarchy, you can call on these skills. And you get them to get closer and closer. So they'd start outside the room, they'd eventually, you know, move in to where they could be standing next to the snake. And then you could eventually work up to them holding the snake. But oftentimes, as I just mentioned, the therapist would model holding the snake too. So my favorite story related to this is my graduate advisor, who I very much admire, is sort of one of those no holds barred people. When she was in grad school, she was working at a behavioral treatment center, and they said, "Oh, we got a case of snake phobia, Jan. You're next up, you're going to treat it." And she said, "I can't." And they said, "Why?" And she said, "Because I'm afraid of the snake." And they said, "We're going to work on that." But yeah, that this is something that works really well, and it can apply to a whole host of situations. So things like working on exposure to heights or elevators, things along those lines. I supervised a clinician who was working with someone with a blood injection injury phobia, and they actually coordinated with the student health center so that their client would go over to the health center and just like get a blood draw. So they got used to it. And I think they actually went with them. I didn't supervise them, but another student clinician was working on someone who had anxiety around public transit. So they worked up to actually riding the bus around campus together. Very cool. As I mentioned, you teach them relaxation techniques or mindfulness techniques so that when the anxiety flares up, they can do things like deep breathing, muscle relaxation in the moment to help with that. A big problem with this model and the treatment based off of it is that it is just too simplistic. It assumes everything is behavioral. Skinner, who was the big operant conditioning guy, did a lot of work with rats and pigeons. He famously said the brain is a black box. It's just stimulus in, response out. I don't care what happens up there. Well, what happens up there is a lot of what psychology is concerned about, right? So it doesn't address everything. It doesn't address underlying beliefs or why that behavior exists the way it does. And another problem is it doesn't always generalize. You might get the person to where they're really comfortable handling that very tame boa constrictor in the therapy room with you, but then they see a little garter snake out when they're walking and they freak out again, right? That being said, behavioral techniques have been incorporated into, I would say, the vast majority of modern therapy. So although this is not necessarily a standalone treatment anymore, we certainly borrow very heavily from the techniques. So how would behaviorists explain our case study? Perhaps he had been negatively unintentionally reinforced for his behavior, right? So this would be positive reinforcement. He acts up, he gets attention, you know, and we know this from kids acting up in classrooms that even if it's negative intention, even if they're getting in trouble, it's still positive reinforcement because what they're looking for is attention, right? So if you shift your focus from the new baby and you say, X, what are you doing? You have given them what they want. Perhaps, working their way through the system, S saw this behavior modeled. So then we mentioned in the long list of things I said going on, a phobia of loud noises, so perhaps some exposure therapy to deal with that again, especially considering there's a new baby in the house and new babies are not quiet, right? They can be quite vocal. Another you can use is what's called a token economy. So this is often used with both kids but also like older adults, people with severe mental illness, where when they do things you want, they kind of have some sort of token, sometimes it's like stickers on a chart, or sometimes it's candy, sometimes it's little tickets or tokens, and you could save them up and you could essentially buy something with them. So I know like a lot of assisted living facilities, for example, will have like bingo, and they can like save up their stuff and buy stuff with their bingo. Or again, kids, you get a certain number of stars. Actually, you know what? The best example I can think of the token economy, when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, Pizza Hut had this thing every summer called Book It. And if you read a certain number of books, you I think you had to have the librarian part of your card, you brought in, you got a free personal pan pizza. So there's a good token economy. Also, Pizza Hut got your parents' money because they had to buy their food, right? So win-win for them. But yeah, so there are lots of ways that might work, again, with a 4-year-old, again, to reward good behavior. And again, thinking about the true pure behavioral idea, not actually being that practical. All right, so out of that grew the cognitive model. And really interestingly, 2 similar theories and techniques for therapy were developed basically simultaneously for the cognitive model. So Albert Ellis developed rational emotive therapy, which is sometimes called rational emotive behavioral therapy. And this consists of helping people think more rationally, think more clearly, think more scientifically, think more flexibly, but also help them to understand and feel their emotions more appropriately and to act more functionally. So there's that behavioral component. Aaron Beck, who actually just passed away a little over a year ago, he developed cognitive theory and cognitive therapy. And he initially developed it for depression, but then it's been applied to a wide variety of disorders. And so this idea was pretty similar to Ellis's, honestly, but he used some different terminology. The idea that there were these cognitive distortions, that people with psychopathology see or think of things differently, not only from other people, but from reality. And that these result in negative automatic thoughts, which are negative thoughts that just pop into our head in certain situations. And they're things that sometimes we don't even realize we're telling ourselves, but they beat us down anyway. And so this leads to the negative cognitive triad, which is that people who are depressed in particular have a negative view of the future, a negative view of themselves, and a negative view of the world around them. So this is a distorted, because Google Slides, diagram of how this model works. So the idea is you're in some sort of situation, and because of these underlying beliefs, these cognitive distortions, you have these automatic thoughts that pop into your head. And those can lead to a whole host of consequences. They can lead to negative emotions. They can lead to, I'm just gonna try and make this a little more legible. Hey, they can lead to problematic behaviors, and they can even lead to physiological responses. So this might be things like someone who is anxious, experiencing shortness of breath, lightheadedness, things along those lines. For people who are depressed, it might be things like not being able to eat or sleep properly. There we go. That's more legible. And so this whole model, and Ellis's model as well, is predicated on the idea that it is not the situation that causes pathology. Instead, it is our interpretation of the situation, what we tell ourselves in those situations that causes these problematic things. So treatment here, depends, right? There are certain situations, I'm giving the example of a traumatic event, right? I don't think our beliefs about the traumatic event are going to cause the initial symptoms, but our beliefs about our guilt or not related to the traumatic events can perpetuate the symptoms. But yeah, there's a lot of cases where, let me do an example with y'all. This is one of my favorite examples. Just to give you an idea of how this might play out. And this is something we would do with clients actually when they came in. All right. So what we're going to do is something that comes from Ellis, but is incorporated into a lot of modern CBT, cognitive therapy, which is we're going to do an ABC sheet. So A is the activating events. Sometimes you hear it called antecedent. B is your beliefs or your thoughts. And C is your consequences. Okay, so the example I use, so let's say you're walking down the middle of campus, like from here to Greer after you're done with class, and you see someone you know, and you wave and you're like, hey, how's it going? And they don't say hi back. All right. So what are some beliefs? What are some automatic thoughts you could have in that moment? To see like, what's going on here? They didn't hear you. They didn't hear me, right? Okay, and if you thought they didn't hear you, what emotions would you experience? What might be the consequences? Yeah, it might just sort of be like, meh, right? Like, shrug it off. It's fine. All right, what are some other ways you could interpret that? Yeah. Yeah. And that might seem extreme to some of you. But you're having a bad day, you're someone with low self-esteem, with depression, this might be a really common negative thought. Okay, what are your consequences going to be if you think they don't like you? How might you feel? Yeah, sad. Yeah, sad, right? More depressed, upset, right? Okay, what are some other things that you could think? Yeah, they're just ignoring me. Yeah, they're ignoring me. And how much you feel if they were ignoring you? Angry, yeah. Why are they ignoring me? What's up? Right? Might even chase them down. Hey, I said hi to you, right? And what's another maybe more empathetic response we could have? Yeah. Yeah, maybe they're having a bad day. And how might we feel if that was the case? Some curious, some empathy, right? And these are just a couple examples. Obviously, if you have psychopathology, this can get more extreme. But a lot of people would say, I saw someone and they didn't say hi to me, and then that made me angry and it ruined my whole day. And what this model suggests, whether you're talking from Ellis or Beck's perspective, is it's not actually the situation, it's sort of what you believe about it. And that belief is a consequence of your pathology, but that it also perpetuates your pathology. right? If you're always telling yourself negative stuff, it's hard not to be depressed or anxious, right? Yeah.
That's why I saw something that was like, if you gaslight yourself into being confident, you will eventually be confident.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to this. And in fact, in a lot of this, we borrowed this from Alfred Adler, who was a psychodynamic psychologist. And it's in a lot of modern therapies now. We'll tell clients, act as if. Go out and act as if you were not depressed. Go act as if you were confident. The other way we describe it is fake it till you make it. Right? And that can be really helpful. And so a lot of times what we do with these sheets is then there's a part at the bottom that's the D, the disputation. And you get the client to argue with themselves about these negative thoughts. And, you know, what would happen if you reframed? And that could take a while. It can be really hard for clients to argue with thoughts that they've believed truly for years and years and years. So in this therapy, it's really been merged with the behavioral model. So it's now CBT, or the cognitive behavioral theory, or cognitive behavioral treatment or therapy. In fact, the major conference I go to each November is the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. I think the only reason they didn't call it cognitive behavioral is because they wanted to keep the ABC part of it. They like that. But basically, it's going to focus in on the underlying negative cognitions and works to help clients modify those thoughts. And sometimes that's just a lot of what you do in therapy, is you have people fill these sheets out throughout the week and you break them down with the clients and you challenge them with different questions. I mean, I use these on myself sometimes because I'm someone who could catastrophize sometimes. I think all of us get in that moment where you're like, oh my gosh, this is going to happen and nothing's going to work out right. And it's sort of like, what's the absolute worst thing that could happen? And could you survive it if it did? What's the best possible scenario? And what's the most likely to happen? Another one I really like is, what would you say to a friend who said this about themselves? We're often a lot more sympathetic, empathetic towards our friends than we are to ourselves, right? So that can be a nice way to challenge things. Like a lot of us are like, don't beat up my friend. But it's okay if I beat up me, right? Let me see here. Oh, these are really widely accepted and they have a ton of empirical support. Again, I go to a whole conference that's just based on research about these theories and therapies. And this is a widely endorsed mode of therapy. That being said, like anything else, and again, I'm trained in this, but like anything else, it's not perfect. There are issues. Yeah. Sure.
Like thinking about this, our natural instinct is to think about if somebody's having a negative thought, right?
Right.
What if somebody has like an overly positive or idealistic thought, like somebody who has narcissistic?
Yeah.
That's two questions. First, do people comfort to therapy like that? And secondly, how would you treat if somebody has like overly positive thoughts?
That's a really good question. Okay, start with part one. Not a lot. So people with personality disorders in general, and there's narcissistic personality disorder, often don't come to therapy. Either they don't think they'll be taken seriously, or for someone who's narcissistic, I don't have a problem. Everyone else has the problem, right? If they do come in, yeah, you would challenge whatever unrealistic thoughts they're having, right? And that's actually something that people sometimes misperceive about cognitive therapy, is they think that it's like to make you think like happy, shiny, but in fact, it's to like help you get to more realistic thoughts. So there's a clip that I usually show, hopefully I'll be able to find it again, when we talk about therapy, cognitive therapy for depression, where Beck is working with a woman who's going through a separation from her husband. He cheated on her. And he said, well, you know, what were your expectations? Just like, I expected loyalty, I expected to stay married. And he was like, well, the divorce rate's 50%. Is that a realistic expectation? And in the moment when you watch it, you're like, holy shit, what are you doing, dude? But it's about that realism, right? And it's not always happy, shiny. So yeah, for someone who's narcissistic, you would also challenge it. I'm like, isn't actually that great, right? I never actually treated anyone with narcissistic PD. I did do an intake on someone. And our supervisors would usually allow us, because the person who did the intake was not always the same person who did therapy. We'd often like pass them off to more advanced therapists. And our supervisors usually allowed us one where it's like, we could take them on, but we get to say, I passed on this person, and he was my pass. He told me he was writing the great American novel. He didn't have a single word typed on a page, you know, he told me his art was the best, and this was the best, and that was the best. So I can imagine there would be a lot of that. And what happens with some of those folks is when you really get down to it, they have anxiety underlying it and insecurity, right? So then you treat that almost more. But yeah, it can be a big challenge. And again, a lot of those folks just don't even come in for therapy because they either don't think anything's wrong, or they just think, like, why would I go to therapy for that? That's for people who are depressed, things along those lines. Yeah, really, really good question. Yeah. Yeah.
Just change the name of that. Change it.
Ooh, good question. No, I don't. I will look it up. Actually, let me try to Google it real quick. I thought they didn't change any of the names, but just the codes, but I could be wrong. Let me try this. IPR. No, looks like it's still called narcissistic PD. Now, ideally, and we'll get into this a lot more when we get to personality disorders. Ideally, the personality disorders are going to be restructured in the 6th edition of the DSM. They did, there was a group of psychologists and psychiatrists who did a lot of really great work to try to revise them. And they presented it in like October or November 2012, and the DSM was published in May 2013. And they were told, oh, it's too late, we can't change it, but we'll stick it in an appendix. It was like, wait, if you can get it in there, it doesn't seem like it's too late to change it. But so right now in the DSM, both in the DSM-5 and in the new text revision of the DSM-5, there are 2 different sets of criteria for the personality disorders. So, you know, we have our shit together, not really. The name of which presentation, sorry. For this class? Oh, no, I don't remember. It was like a one-off at a conference I went to. So I don't know if anyone even recorded it, unfortunately. But yeah, it was like the most demoralized I've ever seen a presentation panel. I felt really bad for them. But yeah, if you just sort of Google like alternate structure for personality disorders, it should be out there. So some cognitive explanations of our case study. That in this stressful situation, he's probably having some negative automatic thoughts. The world is a scary place. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm afraid of losing people if I allow them to show me too much affection because of, again, that history. So cognitive therapy doesn't delve into your early history like psychoanalysis does, but it certainly acknowledges it, if that makes sense, and talks about it if it's relevant. And they would monitor and challenge these thoughts. And they would include those exposure elements, just like the behavioral model for anxiety, and maybe some behavioral methods for treating the hyperactivity as well. Cognitive behavior and behavior-based treatments for ADHD are actually really super effective. All right, there's also the humanistic model. And there are 2 different models we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides that we're going to talk about in a lot less detail. And the humanistic is one of them. And one of the reasons these are talked about in less detail is that they're less popular now. Fewer practitioners really focus on them. But that certainly doesn't mean they're less valid. So humanistic psychology subscribes to the belief that human beings have an innate capacity for goodness and to live a happy, adapted life. However, society is what pressures people to feel they're not right the way they are, to conform to norms, And the idea is that we can lose our identity, we can lose our individuality, and that can lead to psychopathology. And the idea is that people are driven to self-actualization or to self-actualize. Carl Rogers, who developed really the therapy related to this, which is called client-centered or person-centered therapy. He believed that self-actualizing was a verb, it was a process we were all working on. Maslow, who came up with this pyramid of the hierarchy of needs, you probably learned about it in intro if you've taken it. He believed it was like a destination we arrive at psychologically. So the lowest needs are those physiological needs, food, water, sex, he included there, which is interesting. And then safety needs, physical safety, being out of danger, but also psychological security. And then love and belongingness, acceptance by others, esteem needs, competence, approval, recognition. And then he said very few people actually got to self-actualization. In client-centered therapy, you're trying to help people to get in touch with their true selves and accept themselves so that they can really participate in life, be creative, gain meaning, love others and themselves. Client-centered therapy is very reflective. It's a lot of reflective listening and trying to gently guide the person to kind of solve their own problems. So empowering them to do that. And so for us, we might think about meeting those lower needs, particularly safety needs and love and belongingness, and move towards esteem. All right, and then we have the existential model. And this is the idea that people can become so overwhelmed by the pressures of society that they look to others for guidance and they give up their own personal choice in the process. They're just like a chink in the wall, a brick in the wall, you know, just following along in the rat race. People are encouraged in existential therapy to accept responsibility for their life and their problems. And the therapeutic relationship here really focuses on candor, brutal honesty, hard work, and shared learning and growth, challenging the client. I should say client-centered therapy, they don't do a ton of research on. Existential therapy, in a lot of cases, they don't believe in research. They think it dehumanizes people by making them part of a research project. And so for us, they would say, you know, this person needs to start developing responsibility for their own life, their own actions. Therefore, the existential therapy would probably be a challenge with a kiddo. All right. Then you have the sociocultural perspective. And this is where you get more into thinking about not only the individual, but the world around them in more depth. So family systems theory, the family itself is seen as a unit. That's who you're treating. It's the relationship between the family members. You're not treating a bunch of individuals. You're treating that relationship. Often there is what they call the IP or the identified patient. And that's the person who like causes the family to come in. They're the one who's having some sort of psychopathology. And their plight typically represents the plight of a family as a whole. Family therapy, therefore, focuses on the family as a unit. I'll give you a brilliant example. I took a family therapy class while I was in grad school. And our professor told this great story that he had a young boy, 8 or 9, come in with his parents. And the parents were like, he's just getting in trouble in school all the time. He's just, you know, causing all these problems. It's really problematic. And in the initial intake, his parents started bickering back and forth. So my professor, the therapist, said to the little boy, you come sit next to me. He said, they're my problem now. You don't have to worry about it anymore. And the little boy said, yeah, do you see why I act out? The only time they agree is when they're both mad at me. And it sounds crazy that a kid that young would recognize that, but then I had a friend who was seeing a family for therapy, and the young adolescent said the same thing, right? So kids know, kids are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. right? And so in that case, he ended up doing couples therapy, and the kid, wasn't perfect, but got better a lot quicker. So in couples therapy, maybe not surprisingly, it's the relationship between the couple that we're treating. And it can vary in technique, but integrative and behavioral techniques are commonly used. Very important things like getting them to listen to each other. It sounds so silly, but one of the techniques you use is called reflective listening, where you make the members of the couple sit and one of them talks and the other one has to repeat back or summarize what the other person just said. This is really hard for anybody, because what are we usually doing when someone else is talking, especially if we're mad at them? We're not listening. What are we doing in our own minds? Yeah, think about our comeback, right? And they're not allowed to do that. They have to instead reflect, and then they switch, obviously, so both members of the couple get that experience. But it's teaching them to actually listen to the other person. Yeah. Group therapy takes advantage from being able to learn from others, particularly those with similar experiences or conditions. There's additional support. And part of group therapy can also be self-help groups. So you can do this in the absence of a clinician, and in a lot of circumstances that can be really beneficial. Culture and religion are important aspects to keep in mind. We've mentioned already the cultural and racial sensitive therapies that address unique issues for members of minority groups. Now, religion is sort of an interesting case. So therapists originally distanced themselves from it. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of therapists today still do as well. They just, if you want to talk about your religion in the context of what's going on, great, but we're not going to focus in on it. And in fact, Freud himself called religion a defense mechanism. But now a lot of mental health workers see the benefits of faith. We'll incorporate prayer as sort of a version of mindfulness meditation. And as I mentioned previously, there are a lot of ministers or people in that pastoral role who will do mental health treatment. Community treatment emphasizes community care, trying to get clients to receive treatment in familiar surroundings instead of having to be inpatient hospitalized, where you sort of cut off from the real world and don't get the chance to apply what you're learning. And as I mentioned previously, prevention. So trying to improve community attitudes and policies, or identify and treat disorders early before they get really problematic. So where this all boils down is the biopsychosocial model. And so the idea is that abnormality or psychopathology results from the interaction of all these things, from genetic, biological, developmental, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, social, cultural, and societal influences. Yeah, this is the one I really actually subscribe to. This is true. Even if you look at something as simple as the biological model, my intro psych professor, when I took it eons ago, not that long ago, but he said genes are expressed in an environment. And that makes the most sense, right? That everything's going to interact. And these can interact in lots of different ways. So the diathesis stress model, for example, says that you have to have a vulnerability or diathesis to develop a disorder. So this might be biological, like a genetic component or a brain abnormality. It might be social, like having a really maladaptive upbringing, or it can be psychological, like having these destructive or maladaptive cognitions. Then, given a stress trigger, which again can be biological, psychological, social, cultural, that's when the symptoms manifest. So someone could have the propensity, a genetic propensity for depression, but if their life just goes really well, they might never develop symptoms. But if there's a really stressful event, they'd be more likely to develop it than someone without that genetic propensity. The reciprocal effects idea just says that some key factors are going to produce psychopathology by influencing other key factors. So it's more like interrelated rather than you have a diathesis and then stress comes. But other than that, they're pretty comparable. This is an old version. Gosh, this is probably 4 versions of your book ago, but it's still a nice little graph. You certainly don't, or chart rather, you don't have to memorize it. But it kind of shows some of these symptoms or some of these therapies and theories and how they think about the cause of the dysfunction and what the therapist does. All right, and this is our patient. S is Simba, my cat. So we adopted him when he was almost about to turn 2, and he had spent essentially his entire life being passed back and forth through shelters. He had been at Norfolk, Chesapeake, and then we got him when he was at the Virginia Beach SPCA. We had our daughter about a month and a half later, and he did start acting out in ways he hadn't before. Poor thing, it does have a phobia of vacuum cleaners in particular, to the point that if anyone enters our house carrying something large like a suitcase, he thinks there might be a vacuum in there and he runs away. Poor thing. But I just thought it was kind of fun to do a case. He does bite us occasionally. I don't know if y'all noticed all the scratches I had last week, but that was him. He's a little bit of a goof. You can see he does some mindfulness meditation with me sometimes when I do yoga. And he's also my TA when I'm on Zoom. So yeah, just sort of a fun way to look at that. Alrighty, so we got through at least an overview of the models. And starting on Tuesday, we're going to talk about how we do research in this area. Everybody have a great weekend.